All right, we've got a lot to cover here, and Mr. French has
Hello.
been making a lot of news this week, some of it not of his own doing, and there's a lot of news that we want him to comment on as well, so let's get to it. David French, writer at National Review, contributor to Time, constitutional lawyer, author, veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. David, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, you have been quite the hot topic this week. Uh,
Yeah, thanks.
And the back and forth between you and Sohrab Ahmari and then everybody else who's piled in, it is interesting because I mean, if you can strip some of it away, civility, pugnacity, or something else, and two writers who I think you otherwise enjoy, Rusty Reno and Matthew Schmitz at First Things.
I
Uh,
do not otherwise enjoy them.
oh, you don't otherwise enjoy them?
No,
Oh,
no.
okay. All right. Well, then
I
this.
have no respect for Matthew Smith.
Okay, all right. Well, this is going to be even more interesting then. Okay, so Reno and to some extent Schmitz are saying the same thing that civility, pugnacity, we're at a time in the face of cultural Marxism controlling most of the civic institutions in American society, that there is a requirement for a something else that binds us together. And I wonder how you react to that argument as opposed to the civility pugnacity binary.
Well, so there were three things going on here in the attack. All of them are troublesome in different ways. So number one was the original attack was essentially said that, David, you need to understand that politics is war
Right.
and enmity. Okay,
Right.
It is not. It is not. I've been to war. This is not war. Okay, so it is not war. We are talking about fellow citizens of our country. And so when you say politics is war and enmity, I mean, I wonder how many people put on 70 pounds of body armor, ammunition, and arm themselves with weapons to go in and talk to Jack Dorsey of Twitter about Twitter censorship. I mean, this is absurd. It's ridiculous. So it's not war. Then they said, made a direct attack on civility and decency and politics. And now this is curious. Now, if you're not a Christian, it's one argument. But First Things is a Christian journal. Sohrab is a Christian convert.
Mm-hmm.
Rusty Reno is a Christian. Matthew Schmitz is a Christian. And there's direct scriptural there's absolute direct commands in Scripture about how you are to deal with people. And it mandates things like loving your enemies. It mandates treating even opponents with kindness. I mean, like, this is not, hey, this is your tactic you have to use until you need to own the libs. These are commands. They don't even deal with that at all. They talk about this in secular terms. And then the last thing is they essentially make a frontal attack on the American, and let's just be really blunt about it, on the core claims of the American Declaration of Independence, which are that we are endowed with by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments are instituted among men to secure these liberties. So this is the core of the classical liberal framework in the United States. It is one in which the government safeguards liberty. That is its principal purpose. Now, it has other purposes as well, but its principal purpose is to safeguard liberty. And there's this weird idea that this focus on the government as securing liberty is inherently destructive to what they would call the higher good or the common good. That rather than placing the responsibility for virtue onto the citizens, they would say, well, the government is indispensable through the political process for instituting the higher good. Now, this isn't the founder's vision. John Adams said the Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. In the same letter, he noted that our Constitution was too weak to correct for the depravity of the people if the people became depraved. In other words, our constitutional structure is not designed to implement a top-down version of virtue. That comes from the grassroots up.
Okay, but on that score, though, I don't think, and I don't think you're saying this. I don't think Sohrab Ahmari was, or Rusty Reno advocating a theocracy, but I think there's a recognition that every law is a reflection of someone's morality, and so the law should be reflective of the values, morality, if you will, upon which the nation was founded and conceived as a free society.
Well, no. What they're saying essentially is that so let's just take the example that launched this whole thing. Ahmari got really angry that Sacramento Public Library is hosting a drag queen story hour, right? That's when he launched a gratuitous attack on me, saying there's no polite David Frenchian way through this.
Mm-hmm.
And now let's talk about this. Let's suppose Sohrab wants to. What does he want to do about drag queen story hour? Well, if you want the government to ban drag queen story hour, what you're doing is you're going to be saying in liberty, which this is an exercise of liberty, it's free association and it's free speech, is going to be subordinated to their defined version of the higher good or the common good. Now, this is a change in this would necessitate a pretty dramatic change in our legal jurisprudence around free speech and free association to privilege in a much greater degree, the ability of the government to decide which speech is good for us and which speech is not.
Wait,
now,
but aren't
that will not work out well for us.
But that's exactly what's happening in K through 12 institutions and so many other government arenas today. They're privileging the drag queen and the other instruments of cultural Marxism over those who would dissent.
Well, and what's our principal defense to that? It's the institutions and the legal doctrines of classical liberalism. That's where you defend, you go into court, and you allow Christian student groups to operate in those spaces. You allow Christian student groups to even get funding in universities in those spaces.
Right.
You protect
yes.
the ability of Christian professors and teachers to continue to keep their jobs. All of that is protected by the institutions of classical liberalism and individual liberty. And if you degrade that, if you say no, we're not going to do that anymore, because instead what we're going to do is we're going to try to replace the very legal doctrines that are most protective of religious liberty in the United States in favor of a series of doctrines that will allow the government to suppress those liberties when the government believes the higher good conflicts with individual liberty. You're changing America fundamentally. That's a direct attack on the founding.
So you think drag queen story hour should remain?
I don't like drag queen story hour.
I don't like it either, but
I don't think that the government should ban drag queen story hour.
No, right. Of course. No, I'm in agreement with that. And so my take on this is that this is sort of about unilaterally disarming, not taking the left's approach, the left's intolerant central command control approach in advance of conservative principles, but conservatives who disarm in the face of the aggressive, amoral, cultural Marxist who is in charge of these institutions.
If that's what it's about, why attack me? Because
I'm not defending the attacking of you. I'm just saying, the ground that I'm just sort of articulating the ground I think we should be fighting on. I'm not necessarily taking sides in the Ahmari versus French versus, yeah.
But, that's the whole point. The whole point was this is an example of what the kind of politics they want. So this began by an attack on me that was based and had multiple fundamental misrepresentations in it. For example, he said in his piece that my solution to ideological monocultures in universities was better work-life balance. I don't even know where he gets that. And my solution to ideological monocultures in universities was to launch a wave of litigation that has upended speech codes and protected freedom of association from coast to coast. That was my response.
Yeah.
And instead, it was just a better work-life balance. That is a lie. That is a lie. And as a result of those lies, I have been an object of hate online for 10 days. It's absurd. And this is, but see, what you have to understand That's the point of this. That this is demonstrating how they want to fight. How they want to fight is to take a person lie about a person, misrepresent a person, try to expose them to public humiliation and public ridicule in the hopes that what? I'm going to abandon my convictions, that I'll retreat into a hole somewhere. People have been trying to make this high-minded. People have been trying to make this something sophisticated. It was not from its inception. It is not now. It is not high-minded. It is crass. It is not sophisticated. It is stupid.
Perfect. Yeah.
That's
How are
what
you?
this debate is.
It sounds like you're standing strong, but what is the worst? Have you gotten any threats, or are people just ripping on your character and your moral belief?
I can't really discuss the full extent of it, but it is. I will just say this: there are people who are trying to rescue something good from this ruin, that are trying to say, okay, well, let's have a really interesting talk about, classical liberalism versus statism. Those are interesting philosophical comments, and those are interesting philosophical discussions. Or have it about fusionism versus nationalism, which is what Ross Douthat tried to make at New York Times.
Right.
That was not what this was. That was not. Now, we can have those debates, and we should have those debates, and I'm happy to have those debates. But this was not that. This was something else entirely.
But the discussion of it. So a bit earlier in the week, we spoke with Noah Rothman. We brought this up, and he mentioned, he's friendly with both you and Soreb, so he sort of didn't want to get into the middle of it. But it's just interesting what this and again, even though I know you've been tough on Trump sometimes, and there's people that come after you because you're not as pro-Trump as they would like everybody to be, and I made the same point that you just made about your own record of being, on the battlefront, fighting for and litigating for religious liberty and so forth. So just because stylistically or even on particular issues there may be disagreement doesn't mean that this is not a comrade in arms talking about you. But there is something, though, that was disturbing about my conversation with Noah Rothman, who we've been on the show many times, and he's a smart guy and all that. But there's almost, with him, there was almost like there's not a culture war. I mean, I know you didn't hear it, so I don't want you to comment on something you didn't hear. But our audience will confirm there was this kind of like, well, we control some state legislators and they control most of the universities, but we control some universities too. There was sort of this middling of the threat faced to culture by the Marxists, the sentimentalists, that I thought really was, frankly, disturbing. Because I think Noah Rothman was complete, and ironically, he wrote a book about social injustice, but I think he was sort of underestimating what's at stake if you see turf to the cultural Marxists to just say, well, we have to have a civil debate even while you're tearing asunder the foundations of the country.
Well, so there's culture war. Of course there's a culture war. What I think, as I understand his argument, because I've heard him speak, there's a part of it that I agree with, and we can't be catastrophizing when things. Well, a lot of the culture war and the intensity on both sides comes from the conviction on both sides. Believe it or not, I'm going to tell you something, and you'll laugh at this, but there is a conviction on the left that they're losing the culture war.
Yeah, well.
So,
yeah, but I guess that's what Noah Rothman is in part saying is like, well, they do that to foment their base and to keep the fight up, and the same way conservatives do. But you can say that, but you're right. It's a laugh line because we look at the scoreboard.
Well, yeah. So they look at the scoreboard and they say we just passed more heartbeat bills than have ever been passed in the history of the United States, and which is a really very, very positive development that depends on a culture of life having been nurtured and sustained and actually grown in this country since Roe. So the bottom line is there are two culture wars. There's not just one. So culture war number one is the classic one that we have been thinking about for years, life or abortion, religious liberty, gun rights, the sort of the God gun gaze formulation that Obama talked about back in the day. That's the shorthand for the classic culture war. So that's one culture war. But there's another one emerging right now, and that's liberal versus illiberal.
Yeah.
And so the most toxic form of the culture war is illiberal using illiberal means to fight for destructive policies. And that's sort of your woke social justice warriors. These are the people who are trying to silence and deplatform and all of that. So they're not only on the wrong side, in my view, of the cultural issues, they're on the wrong side of the illiberal versus liberal. But what we're having emerging on the right is a battle over illiberal versus liberal as well. And they're using the illiberalism of their opponents to mimic their tactics and, in very important ways, mimic their philosophy.
I hear that, and I have concerns in that same direction. But let me ask you this: do you think it would be helpful to blunt those tendencies or impulses if we made it clear that, hey, look, very much like we talk about this in the context of geopolitics, one of the things you have to understand is that Putin doesn't want what we want. So if you don't understand what Putin actually wants, then you're not going to engage him in the right way, for example. And so the same thing bears, forgive the autocratic comparison, but the same thing here. The cultural Marxists, they don't actually want the same, and we're not all trying to get to the same place. They don't want the same thing that people believe in free minds and free markets and a free society want. And if you don't understand that, then you're not going to engage them in the right way.
And you also need to understand that Sohrab does not want what you want if you're using the term free minds and free markets. So he might be on your side on a life issue, but he's not on your side on individual liberty. He's not on your side on free markets, and he's not on your side on the power of the state. So this is something that's happening in a pretty interesting way on the right, and I'm utterly opposed to it, just as I'm opposed to this, this cultural Marxism construct. The issue here that we have is that if you want free minds and free markets, if you want individual liberty, if you would like to see religious liberty and free speech and freedom of association and due process protected for all Americans, increasingly you're going to fight a two-front war. You're going to be fighting against the opponents of your conservative that you've long known and understood for most of your adult life. And you're also going to be fighting against a cohort of people on the right, I'm not going to call them conservatives, who are fundamentally illiberal, who fundamentally believe in dramatically expanding the power of the state, and fundamentally believe in undermining First Amendment and other individual liberties in the Bill of Rights to fight their own culture war. And that's what this is about. It's not fusionism versus nationalism. It's not Trump or not Trump. It is liberalism versus illiberalism. And the reason you're deceived often into thinking that these people are quote-unquote on our side is because on specific individual issues, they're going to agree with you. They're going to be against abortion, for example, which is huge. It's hugely important. But to then say, well, that very phrase that you said, free minds and free markets, would cause a Rusty Reno nowadays to break out into hives. This is what they call libertarian conservatism, and it's the enemy to them. And I think that what we have to understand is what is actually happening here is a fundamental change amongst many people in their view of the role of the government, in their view of the power of the government, and their belief in free markets. This is a big change happening, and one of the ways, and it's combined with a change in the way that conservatives have traditionally believed that they should interact with the culture. They have allowed about the 8% of the country that are sort of the extremely progressive, the people who disproportionately populate big tech and Hollywood and the academy, to sort of twist and warp their thinking in the way that they interact with the entire culture, from a position of hostility, from a position of combativeness, often from a position of outright cruelty. And I just don't think that's the way conservatives should interact with the culture, period.
He is David French, writer at National Review, contributor to Time, constitutional lawyer, author, veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. David, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.